You have probably never thanked the humming box in your kitchen for saving your life. But it has. Every single day. Right now, somewhere in your house, a machine is quietly preventing bacteria from turning your dinner into a biohazard, and you barely think about it. You open the door, grab the milk, close it again. No ceremony, no gratitude, just routine. It was not always this simple. For most of human history, keeping food cold was not a button press. It was a battle. People dug pits into hillsides. They cut ice from frozen lakes with handsaws in the dead of winter and prayed it would survive the summer. They built entire industries around a substance that melted the moment you stopped paying attention to it. And later, when someone finally figured out how to make cold on demand, that invention came wrapped in poisonous gas, exploding pipes, and a price tag that only the wealthy could afford. Today, we are going to trace the strange, occasionally toxic, occasionally heroic story of how a wooden box packed with ice became the single most trusted appliance in the modern home. Along the way, you will learn why a Boston businessman once shipped frozen lake water halfway around the world for profit, why early refrigerators sometimes killed the very families they were meant to protect, and why one of the most important environmental treaties on Earth exists largely because of what was humming in your grandmother's kitchen. Stick around, because the ending of this story is not what you expect. Let's start before the machine, before electricity, before the word refrigerator even existed in the way we use it now. Ancient civilizations were obsessed with cold in their own limited way. In Egypt and India, people used porous clay containers filled with water. As the water seeped through the clay and evaporated on the outside, it pulled heat away from the liquid inside, cooling it down. It is a clever trick of physics, and it worked well enough that variations of it are still used today in parts of the world without reliable electricity. Ancient Greeks, Romans, and Hebrews packed snow around food to slow spoilage. Chinese households were cutting and storing ice for food preservation as far back as 1,000 years before the Common Era. None of this was refrigeration in the mechanical sense. It was simply humanity working with what nature handed it, one snowbank and one clay pot at a time. The real shift began in the 1700s, and it started oddly enough with a Scottish professor demonstrating a party trick. In 1748, William Cullen, a physician and academic at the University of Glasgow, showed an audience something strange. He used a pump to create a partial vacuum above a container of ether, and the ether began to boil at a much lower temperature than usual. As it boiled and turned from liquid to gas, it pulled heat from its surroundings. The area around the container actually got colder. Cullen had just demonstrated the basic principle behind every refrigerator that would ever be built. Evaporating a liquid absorbs heat. That is it. That is the secret. Everything that came after was just engineers finding better ways to exploit that one simple fact. But here is the twist. Cullen never turned his discovery into a machine. He showed it off, published his findings, and moved on. It would take more than half a century and a very different kind of entrepreneur before anyone figured out how to make real money from cold. That entrepreneur was a Boston merchant named Frederick Tudor, and his story is honestly one of the strangest business ventures in American history. In the early 1800s, Tudor looked at the frozen ponds of New England in the winter and saw not a nuisance, but a product. Starting around 1806, he began harvesting massive blocks of ice from lakes like Fresh Pond in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and shipping them to warmer climates. His first shipment went to the Caribbean island of Martinique. People thought he was out of his mind. Ship frozen water across the ocean to the tropics on a wooden ship with no refrigeration technology to keep it from melting along the way. It sounded like a joke. It was not a joke. Tudor built specialized ice houses with thick insulation, packed the ice in sawdust and straw to slow the melt, and figured out the logistics of an industry that had never existed before. Within a few decades, he earned the nickname the Ice King, and the business he pioneered exploded into something genuinely massive. By the height of the American ice trade, tens of thousands of workers across North America were employed cutting, hauling, storing, and shipping natural ice. Crews would head out onto frozen lakes each winter with horse-drawn saws and plows, cutting blocks, sometimes 2 feet thick, racing against the clock before a thaw ruined the harvest. This ice traveled by train and by ship to cities across the country, and even overseas, as far as India and South America. Boston's own ice consumption jumped from around 6,000 tons to 85,000 tons in just a few decades during the mid-1800s. Norway, on the other side of the Atlantic, was exporting roughly 1 million tons of ice a year at the industry's peak. Picture that for a second. An entire global supply chain built around cutting frozen water out of a lake in January and rushing it to a kitchen in July before it turned back into a puddle. It sounds almost absurd from where we are standing now with a machine in the kitchen that makes ice on command. But for a solid century, this was cutting-edge technology. This was how the wealthy, and eventually the middle class, kept their food from spoiling in the summer heat. And this is where the Iceman enters the story. A character who would become a fixture of daily life in cities and towns for generations. Every few days, a horse-drawn cart, and later a motorized truck, would roll down the street, and the Iceman would haul enormous blocks into homes using massive metal tongs, dropping them into wooden cabinets called iceboxes. These iceboxes were the direct ancestor of the modern refrigerator. Insulated with materials like sawdust, seaweed, and straw, they had a compartment up top for the ice and a lower section for food, with cold air sinking down to keep everything chilled. By the 1890s, iceboxes had become fairly common in upper and middle-class homes across America. Families budgeted for regular ice deliveries the way we now budget for electricity bills. It was simply part of the rhythm of domestic life. Here is one of those little historical details that tends to stick with people. Before he became a legendary American football player in the 1920s, Red Grange spent a summer working as an iceman to build strength and endurance for the season ahead. Hauling frozen blocks up flights of stairs all day turned out to be excellent training. The ice trade was not some quaint, gentle industry. It was brutal, physical labor, dependent entirely on the weather cooperating each winter. And that dependence on weather was exactly the vulnerability that would eventually kill the entire industry. Because while men were still out on frozen lakes with handsaws, a completely different group of people, scientists and engineers, were working on a way to make cold without needing a single lake to freeze at all. Remember William Cullen's little demonstration from 1748? Other inventors picked up that thread across the 1800s and slowly turned it into something practical. In 1805, an American named Oliver Evans drew up designs for what would have been the world's first mechanical refrigeration machine, though he never actually built it. That task fell to Jacob Perkins, who in 1834 constructed a working vapor compression refrigerator, using many of the same basic principles that power your refrigerator today. A Florida physician named John Gorey took things further in the 1840s, building a machine to produce ice and cool the rooms of patients suffering from yellow fever, eventually earning the first American patent for artificial ice production in 1851. Meanwhile, in Europe, a German engineer named Carl von Linde was refining the process even more, developing techniques for liquefying gases that would prove essential for industrial-scale refrigeration. By the turn of the 20th century, mechanical refrigeration had already transformed entire industries. Breweries used it. Meatpacking plants used it. Commercial cold storage facilities sprang up in major cities, allowing food to travel much farther than it ever had before without spoiling. But all of this was industrial. Massive machines, professional operators, dedicated facilities. Nobody had yet figured out how to shrink this technology down small enough, safe enough, and cheap enough to sit in an ordinary family's kitchen. That breakthrough started to arrive in the 1910s, and honestly, the early attempts were rough. In 1913, an American named Fred W. Wolf introduced something called the Domel ray, short for domestic electric refrigerator. It was essentially a mechanical cooling unit bolted onto the top of an existing icebox. It worked, sort of, but it was clunky, expensive, and only a few hundred units were ever produced. A year later, an engineer named Nathaniel Wales began developing ideas that would eventually evolve into the Kelvinator brand. Then, in 1916, a man named Alfred Mellowes built something genuinely new, a refrigerator with the compressor built into the bottom of the cabinet itself, a fully self-contained unit rather than a separate add-on box. Mellowes started manufacturing these commercially, but he was not much of a businessman, and in 1918, automotive tycoon William C. Durant bought out his company. Durant, who had already built and lost control of General Motors once, saw enormous potential in home refrigeration, and he launched a company to mass produce these self-contained units under a name you have almost certainly heard before: Frigidaire. This is where things start to feel a little more familiar to modern ears. These early 1920s refrigerators were genuinely strange-looking by today's standards, often requiring the compressor and motor to be installed in a completely separate room, sometimes the basement, because the machinery was so loud and hot. A cold box would sit in the kitchen, connected by pipes to a noisy mechanical unit somewhere else in the house, and the price tag was staggering. A basic unit could run anywhere from $500 to $1,000, which translates to somewhere around $6,500 to $13,000 in today's money. This was not an appliance for the average family. This was a luxury item, a status symbol, something you might see in the home of a doctor or a banker, not a factory worker. There was also, and this part tends to surprise people, a genuinely dangerous side to these early machines. Before the 1930s, home refrigerators relied on refrigerant gases like ammonia, methyl chloride, and sulfur dioxide to move heat around inside the system. These gases worked fine when everything was sealed properly. The problem was that seals fail, pipes crack, and when they did, these toxic gases would leak directly into people's kitchens. There were multiple documented incidents of injury and even death throughout the 1920s caused by refrigerant leaks in ordinary homes. Imagine buying the most expensive, most modern appliance available, installing it proudly in your kitchen, and then having it potentially poison your family while they slept. That was the real risk hiding behind the shiny convenience of early refrigeration. Something had to change. And it did, through an unlikely partnership. Three companies, Frigidaire, General Motors, and DuPont, teamed up specifically to solve this safety crisis. The man who led the chemistry effort was Thomas Migley Jr., working alongside Charles Kettering of General Motors. In 1928, they developed a new class of chemical compound, chlorofluorocarbons, which the world would come to know by a trade name that became almost synonymous with refrigeration itself: Freon. Freon was, by the standards of the time, a genuine miracle chemical. It was stable. It was non-toxic to breathe. It would not catch fire. It solved the safety crisis almost overnight, and it opened the door for refrigerators to finally become something an ordinary family might actually consider buying. The real turning point for mass adoption came in 1927, when General Electric introduced a model that would become an icon, the monitor top. Designed under the leadership of engineer Christian Steenstrup, the monitor top featured a fully sealed refrigeration system with a distinctive round compressor sitting on top of the cabinet, which reportedly reminded people of the armored gun turret on the Civil War ironclad ship, the USS Monitor, hence the nickname. This was the first electric home refrigerator that could genuinely be called commercially successful. It was reliable. It was relatively affordable compared to earlier models. And with Freon making it safe, General Electric could finally market this thing to ordinary American families without worrying about a lawsuit. Now here is one of those open loops I promised you earlier, the twist you probably did not see coming. You would assume that a luxury appliance like the home refrigerator would have struggled during one of the worst economic disasters in American history. Instead, the opposite happened. The refrigerator's rise to mainstream ownership took off during the Great Depression. At the start of the 1930s, only about 8% of American households owned a mechanical refrigerator. By the end of that same decade, that number had rocketed to 44%. In the middle of breadlines and mass unemployment, refrigerator ownership more than quintupled. Why? Partly because prices were finally coming down as manufacturing scaled up and competition increased. Partly because the refrigerator had become a powerful symbol of middle-class stability, something families aspired to even when money was tight, a visible proof that you had made it, even a little. And partly, frankly, because it actually saved households money over time by reducing food waste and cutting down on the cost of ice deliveries. Then came the Second World War, and everything accelerated even further. Wartime manufacturing pushed technology and mass production techniques forward at an incredible pace, and when soldiers came home to a booming post-war economy, refrigerator ownership exploded. By the middle of the 20th century, the overwhelming majority of American homes had one. Today, that figure sits at roughly 99.5%, a level of market penetration that even television never quite matched. But the refrigerator did not just sit quietly in the corner of the kitchen, changing nothing else about how people lived. It rewired entire systems around it. Before reliable refrigeration existed, cooking and food preservation were nearly the same activity. Families pickled vegetables, smoked meats, salted fish, and brewed hard cider and cheese, essentially because these were some of the only reliable ways to keep food edible through a long winter without it going bad. Once the icebox, and later the electric refrigerator, arrived, food could simply be kept fresh in its original form for days at a time. You did not need to transform your cucumbers into pickles out of desperation. You could just, keep the cucumbers. This changed shopping habits almost completely. Daily trips to a local market for fresh ingredients gave way to weekly, even monthly grocery runs, because a family could now buy in bulk and trust that the food would still be good when they got around to eating it. This shift fed directly into the explosive growth of supermarkets across American cities. Between 1948 and 1958 alone, the number of supermarkets in the United States roughly doubled, expanding largely into the growing suburbs. The refrigerator and the supermarket essentially grew up together, each one making the other more useful, more necessary, more profitable. And there is a deeper social shift tucked inside all of this that historians have spent real time studying. Researchers examining the economic impact of household appliances, including a widely cited study from the Université de Montreal, found that the spread of labor-saving devices like refrigerators and washing machines freed up enormous amounts of time that had previously been consumed by daily domestic labor. In 1890, most American households did not even have running water, and the average family hauled thousands of gallons of water and tons of coal every single year just to keep a home functioning. Refrigeration, alongside other new appliances, chipped away at that burden dramatically. Some economists argue this shift was one of the meaningful factors that allowed more women to move into paid employment over the course of the 20th century, gradually reshaping the workforce, family economics, and eventually even the gender wage gap. A kitchen appliance, quietly reorganizing the American labor market. Try explaining that one to someone shopping for a fridge today. Of course, it was not all liberation and progress without complication. Historians studying the 1950s also point out that the rise of refrigeration, combined with heavy marketing from food companies, pushed many households toward processed and packaged convenience foods. The freezer compartment, standard in most models by 1940, opened the door to an entirely new category of frozen meals and prepared dishes. Advertisers promised that all this new technology would liberate the housewife from endless kitchen drudgery. In some ways, it did. In other ways, as some historians have noted, it simply replaced one set of routines with another, isolating many women inside increasingly automated, increasingly private homes. Meanwhile, that miracle chemical Freon, the thing that made all of this mainstream growth possible in the first place, was quietly setting up a much bigger problem for the future. This is the second open loop finally paying off. For decades, chlorofluorocarbons like Freon sat inside refrigerators and air conditioners around the world, doing their job perfectly well. But every leak, every scrapped machine that was not properly disposed of, released tiny amounts of these chemicals into the atmosphere. Over enough time and with enough refrigerators, those tiny amounts added up to something enormous. These compounds drifted up into the stratosphere, where ultraviolet light broke them apart and released chlorine atoms. That chlorine began attacking and depleting the ozone layer, the protective shield that blocks harmful ultraviolet radiation from reaching the surface of our planet. Scientists first detected a dramatic thinning of ozone over Antarctica in the 1980s, and the culprit traced directly back to CFCs, the very same family of chemicals sitting inside virtually every refrigerator on Earth. The response was one of the most remarkable examples of international cooperation in modern history. In 1987, representatives from countries around the world signed the Montreal Protocol, an international treaty specifically designed to phase out ozone-depleting substances like Freon. It remains one of the only treaties in history to achieve universal ratification, meaning literally every country on the planet eventually signed on. Manufacturers scrambled to replace CFCs with less harmful alternatives, first with hydrochlorofluorocarbons, and later with hydrofluorocarbons, which do not damage the ozone layer at all, though scientists later discovered they carry their own climate concerns due to their heat-trapping potential. That story is still evolving today through later agreements like the Kigali Amendment. But the headline result is genuinely encouraging. The Montreal Protocol is widely credited with putting the Antarctic ozone hole on a path toward long-term recovery, and it is often cited by scientists as the most successful environmental treaty ever enacted. Your refrigerator, sitting quietly in your kitchen right now, is running on a refrigerant that exists specifically because the entire world agreed that the previous chemical was too dangerous to keep using. Think about that the next time you grab a cold drink. That simple act connects you to a Scottish professor's ether demonstration in 1748, a Boston ice tycoon shipping frozen lakes to the tropics, a General Electric engineer building a machine shaped like a warship turret, and a global treaty that helped heal a hole in the sky above Antarctica. From there, the refrigerator kept evolving, sometimes in genuinely surprising directions. The 1950s brought bold color choices into American kitchens, with brands introducing shades with names like Harvest Gold and Avocado Green, turning a purely functional appliance into a design statement. The 1970s gave us the first side-by-side door configurations. The 1980s brought a new wave of energy-efficient models, responding to rising electricity costs and growing environmental awareness. And in recent years, refrigerators have quietly become one of the most connected devices in the modern home, equipped with touchscreens, internet connectivity, inventory tracking, and cameras that let you check what is inside from your phone while standing in a grocery store aisle, wondering if you actually need more eggs. An average refrigerator today lasts somewhere around 17 years, which sounds like a long time until you consider that the very first mass-produced monitor top models from 1927 typically lasted only 8 to 10 years before needing replacement. We have gotten remarkably good at building these machines. So good, in fact, that we barely notice them anymore. They have become wallpaper, background noise, an assumed feature of civilized life rather than a marvel of engineering and international policy. But maybe that is exactly the point of this story. The most transformative technologies are often the ones that disappear into the background of daily life so completely that we forget they were ever revolutionary at all. Nobody wakes up grateful for indoor plumbing either, and yet tried living without it for a week. The refrigerator did not just change what we eat. It changed how we shop, how we work, how women's roles shifted across an entire century. And it forced humanity to confront and fix a genuine hole in the planet's atmosphere. All of that, tucked inside a humming metal box that most of us open and close a dozen times a day without a second thought. So here is a small suggestion. Next time you are standing in front of your open refrigerator door, staring blankly inside, trying to decide what to eat, take half a second to appreciate the sheer improbable journey it took to get that box into your kitchen. Frozen lakes, toxic gas leaks, a treaty that saved the sky. If a story like that does not deserve at least a passing thought, I do not know what does. And if you enjoyed learning where the ordinary objects around you actually came from, stick around and subscribe, because this channel exists to keep digging up stories like this one, hidden in plain sight, inside the things you already own.